In late December 2025, something shifted on the streets of Tehran. Not overnight, not with a single slogan, but with a quiet sense that patience, long stretched, had begun to snap. What started around Iran's collapsing economy did not stay there. Within days, it spilled into the language of legitimacy, power, and political authority. Iran has seen protests before, many times, but why does this wave feel different? I'm Afzal Ahmed and this is Aloud. This show brings you articles made for audio. In this episode, we've adapted the piece, How Iran's Latest Protests Mark a Break from Past Cycles of Dissent, by Atta Shahid, published on TRT World on January the 10th, 2026. To understand what's unfolding now, you have to look back. Over the past 8 years, Iran has lived through repeated waves of unrest. Each one left scars, but each followed a recognizable pattern. In 2019 and 2020, protests erupted after fuel rationing and a sudden spike in gasoline prices. They were driven by material grievance, anger at rising costs, and anger at repression. Then came 2022 and 2023. After the death of Mahsa Amini, protests shifted towards identity, civil liberties, and systematic injustice. Economic pain on one side, cultural and political demands on the other. Mahsa Amini was a 22-year-old woman who was detained by Iran's morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf improperly. She died in hospital after that. What's happening now doesn't fit neatly into either category. This time, economic collapse and political demands are colliding, openly and rapidly. The immediate triggers were familiar. The national currency plunged, import-dependent businesses faltered, the cost of living climbed higher. But the protests didn't remain reactive. They began in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, a place that carries deep political weight in Iran's history. During the 1979 revolution, the bazaar was not just an economic hub, but a social engine of mobilization. When merchants close their shops in Iran, it sends a message. By late December, shop closures and strikes spread through Tehran's commercial arteries. And then, the boundaries broke. Demonstrations moved from arcades and markets onto main streets and symbolic public spaces. Economic frustration merged with political language and crossed a threshold. Within days, protests spread far beyond Tehran. Demonstrations were reported in dozens of cities. The movement expanded again, geographically and socially. Cities like Shiraz, Isfahan, Ahvaz, Karaj, and Kermanshah joined in. Universities followed. Students brought new energy and new demands, allowing economic despair to fuse with calls for political representation and freedom. Footage began circulating, alleging that security forces had opened fire on protesters. With reported deaths, the unrest crossed into a security crisis. Then came January. Protests erupted simultaneously across dozens of provinces. Radical slogans targeted the political system itself, including Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. This escalation sharpened a central question. Why does this protest wave feel more dangerous and more fragile than those before? Part of the answer lies outside Iran's borders. As protests spread, international reactions hardened. US President Donald Trump warned that if Iran killed peaceful protesters, the United States would come to their, quote, rescue. He repeated the warning. No previous US president in half a century of hostility in Iran-US relations has framed Iran's internal unrest in such explicit rescue terms. For Iran's leadership, the language revives memories of Iraq and Afghanistan, interventions that still loom large in the country's political imagination. As demonstrations expanded, both Western statements and the rhetoric of Iran's political and security elites hardened, with the unrest increasingly framed as a struggle between internal order and external intervention. Inside Iran, the response has fractured. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has framed the protests narrowly, describing them as livelihood-related complaints while condemning what he calls chaos. In a January speech, he accused protesters of vandalism designed to please the President of the United States. The judiciary went further, and authorities responded with a nationwide internet shutdown. Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei announced zero leniency, ordering swift trials and verdicts, explicitly linking harsh measures to foreign support for the protests. Gholam Hossein justified this hardening stance by pointing to expressions of support from the United States, Israel, and Donald Trump, presenting foreign reactions as evidence of the unrest's underlying drivers. The presidency struck a different tone. President Masoud Pezeshkian urged restraint, tolerance, and reflection. His deputy said security forces were instructed to avoid heavy-handed responses unless national security was threatened. But Iran's political structure limits how far that approach can go. Security forces ultimately answer to the supreme leader, not the president. Conciliatory rhetoric rarely translates into institutional restraint. Another familiar name resurfaced in the international discourse, Reza Pahlavi. Israel-affiliated media circulated claims portraying the protests as under his leadership. On the ground, that narrative doesn't hold. Reza Pahlavi lacks an inclusive political base inside Iran and has little organizational capacity. His resonance is largely confined to small diaspora groups. His role here is largely symbolic, useful for sustaining regime change narratives abroad rather than reflecting internal dynamics. What truly sets this moment apart is timing. These protests came just months after the 12-day Iran-Israel war in June. During that conflict, external calls for Iranians to rise up failed. The outcome was widely read as domestic consolidation. After the war, authorities softened their tone, emphasizing unity and resilience. But the calm didn't last. Economic strain, governance failures, and unmet expectations returned, sharper than before. Warnings came not only from opposition figures, but from within the system itself. Former Presidents Hassan Rouhani and Mohammad Khatami, alongside President Pezeshkian, have all pointed to growing societal despair. From Israel's perspective, the conflict may not have ended. It may have shifted inward. So what does this moment represent? Not a fleeting outburst and not an imminent collapse. What's emerging instead is a phase marked by eroding social patience, elite fragmentation, post-war anxiety, and heightened sensitivity to foreign intervention. Confidence in the system's capacity for reform is thinning, and that makes the period ahead more fragile and more unpredictable than the cycles Iran has known before. That's all for this episode of Aloud, based on the piece How Iran's Latest Protests Mark a Break from Past Cycles of Dissent by Atta Shahid, published on TRT World on January the 10th, 2026. I'm your host Afzal Ahmed. Thanks for listening.